going to start this morning's meeting. Very warm welcome to all of you, especially those whose Marxism is starting today, who couldn't get to any of the meetings yesterday, but don't worry, there's lots more to come over the weekend. I'm sure all of you are aware, but just to reinforce that there's been a change to the timetable this morning, that unfortunately Susan George couldn't join us today, but very fortunately Alex Callinicos has stepped into the breach to talk on the very important subject of Palestine and what's the solution for Palestine. Alex is a leading member of the Socialist Workers' Party and an author of many excellent books, including The Revolutionary Ideas of Karl Marx and the Anti-Capitalist Manifesto and so on, which are available in bookmarks. We are going to use a speaker slip system this morning, so for any of you who aren't familiar with that, the Marxism team in the red T-shirts will be walking up and down waving bits of paper. If you put your hand up, they'll give you a bit of paper, you just fill in your name and a brief outline of what you want to say, hand it back, and then that enables us to call a whole range of opinions and so on in the discussion. Alex is going to speak for about 30-35 minutes, and then we'll have that discussion, so I'll hand you over to Alex.
Okay, well, I think it's important to start by saying that what has happened to the Palestinians, not simply over the whole span of the period since their expulsion in 1947-48, but more immediately in the past few years, is an absolute obscenity. It's a standing condemnation of the kind of world in which we live, that what's happened to the Palestinians has happened and has been allowed to continue. It's not, if we think in historical terms, those Palestinians were subjected to two bouts of ethnic cleansing, mass expulsion in the wars of 1948 and 1967. The land that was internationally recognized as theirs, but that was occupied by Israel in 1967, the West Bank and Gaza, has been subjected to the massive expansion of Zionist settlements seizing their land. And they've been also subjected to the indignity of a peace process whose aim essentially has been to institutionalize and perpetuate the subordination and dispersion of the Palestinian people. A couple of months ago, the United Nations published a map of Palestine and Israel, and it's an incredible document because it shows to what extent, as a result of the so-called peace process and the settlement expansion, the territories, the West Bank in particular, have been systematically fragmented in order to perpetuate the settlements and to protect them and to perpetuate Israeli dominance over the area. But what's happened just in the last few years is even worse. We've had a Bush administration that has allowed successive Israeli governments to mete out bombardments and assassinations against the Palestinians with impunity. When the Palestinian people exercised their democratic right to elect Hamas with a parliamentary majority last year, remember that Bush, Blair, Brown, all the rest of them are in favour of bringing democracy to the Middle East. The Palestinians were punished for this by an economic blockade imposed on them by the so-called international community. You know, when people talk about the international community, I'm reminded of what Gandhi said about Western civilization, namely that it would be a good idea. And now, even worse, we have a situation in which essentially the US, Britain and Israel have engineered a civil war among the Palestinians themselves, in which it's very, very clear that the West plus Israel are backing Fatah, the former majority party among the Palestinians, and are arming and aiding it in the struggle to crush Hamas. Now, from a historical point of view, this is incredible. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon with the main aim of destroying Fatah and its bases in Lebanon. Now, a few weeks ago, and this indicates the complicity of the Arab regimes as well in what's happening, the Egyptian government opened the border to allow 500 presidential guards, in other words, mercenaries acting on behalf of the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, to enter Gaza. These were troops who had been supported by Israel and trained by the United States. That's the extent to which the West and Israel are engineering a civil war among the Palestinians. And what that means that today, Abbas, I mean, a lot of you here aren't old enough to remember the Bantustan system in South Africa, the tribal statelets that the South African racist regime set up to give some spurious legitimacy to its racist rule. Well, this is what Abbas is being reduced to. He's like Kaiser Matanzima or Lucas Mangope or the other disgusting creeps who oppressed their own people on behalf of the South African regime. But let's not forget the final insult. The final insult is that George Bush decides that to bring about peace in the Middle East, Tony Blair is going to be the representative of the so-called quartet of great powers. I'm not sure who this is a greater insult to, actually, the Palestinians or Blair, because it's, on the one hand, it's clear that Bush doesn't give a damn about peace in the Middle East. So, you know, what an insult to Blair to be given this non-existent job. But on the other hand, what an insult to the Palestinians. The idea that this, you know, one of the main architects of the Iraq War could bring peace to the Middle East. But it's not enough just to wail at what's happening to the Palestinians. The great Jewish philosopher Spinoza had a slogan, neither weep nor laugh, but understand. And it's very important that if we're going to address how to reverse the tragic situation of the Palestinians, we have to try and understand why it is that the Palestinians have been so desperately defeated when so many other national liberation movements have won. Now, you can say that one fact is the politics, in particular the Palestine Liberation Organization and Fatah as the dominant force within it. And that's an important factor. Fatah is a classical revolutionary nationalist movement that has focused on achieving national liberation and has treated the struggle for national liberation as quite separate from the class struggle against capitalism. Concretely, what that's meant is that, particularly under Arafat's leadership, the historic leader of Fatah and of the PLO, died a couple of years ago, the strategy of Fatah and the strategy of the Palestine Liberation Movement was critically premised on alliances with the Arab regimes like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. The basic problem with that is that regimes like Egypt and Saudi Arabia are as crucial allies of the United States as Israel is. And therefore, what that's meant is that the Palestinian movement has been systematically crippled in its efforts to actually fight against Israel. At every great juncture, when the Palestinians have been confronted by the military might of Israel, for example, during the 82 war, or more recently with the two intifadas, the Arab regimes have stood by and allowed the movement to be crushed and defeated. Now, of course, and this is critical to why Hamas, an Islamist movement, has begun to displace Fatah as the dominant political force among Palestinians. It's very important to understand that while Hamas is a very dynamic and effective movement, as we can see in what they've managed to do in winning control of Gaza in the past few weeks, it's not immune to the kind of contradictions that Fatah are subject to. So I was at the Cairo conference against Zionism and occupation that took place, well, obviously in Cairo, in March, and there was a speech from, I think, the vice president of Hamas that was very interesting, because on the one hand there was tons about resistance and defying the Zionists and defying the US and down with all the occupations and so on, but then he also thanked the Saudi regime for brokering the deal that had just taken place, which led to the creation of a coalition government of both Fatah and Hamas, a deal which, of course, has now collapsed in disarray. In other words, there's the same dual orientation on the part of Hamas as on the part of Fatah towards national liberation and collaboration with the Arab regimes. And sooner or later, that is going to create huge problems for Hamas. So there's a problem with the politics of the Palestinian movement, but that's not enough to explain why the Palestinian movement has suffered such terrible defeats, because fundamentally the politics I've described is the same as that of many other anti-colonial movements, national liberation movements around the world, which did succeed, at least in ending foreign domination. So we have to look for something else. And I think the answer is that the Palestinians are subject to a fairly unique structural disadvantage. What is Israel? Israel is a settler colonial state. That's fundamental. There's a particular ideology that cements and legitimizes it, which is Zionism, but nevertheless Israel is a settler colonial state of a type that has been historically quite important in the history of Western imperialism. Now, settler colonial states involve people from the imperialist metropolis moving into a country, seizing it, and coming to dominate and live there in the long term, in alliance with the major imperialist powers in one form or other. Now, if you're a settler colonial state, you have the problem of the local population. What do you do with them? Now, historically, there are two solutions to the problem. One is extermination. Extermination one could call the American way. That's what the United States did to the Native Americans. It exterminated them. So you just get rid of the local population and replace them with settlers. That's one solution. The other is exploitation. That's largely what happened in different parts of Africa. In places like Algeria, Zimbabwe, South Africa, you had the establishment of settler colonial states in which the settlers were a privileged minority ruling over a majority who were the native population, and the functioning of the settler colony depended upon the labour of the oppressed native population, the Arabs and Berbers in Algeria, or the blacks in Zimbabwe and South Africa. Now, at one level, that's very nice. The problem is that it creates a structural dependence of the settler regime on those it's oppressing and exploiting. And that means that once the majority begin to get politically organised, then the regime is doomed. And so we've seen the fall of the settler colonial states in Algeria, in Zimbabwe, and in South Africa, in complicated forms. But nevertheless, all those regimes have now gone. Now, Israel represents a third type of settler colonial state, which neither exterminated the native population, nor, in a systematic way, exploits them. The one key dimension of the Zionist project from the start was the exclusion of the Palestinians who lived there when the Zionist project began to establish itself at the beginning of the 20th century. Exclusion, not simply in the sense of stealing the Palestinians' land, but also in the sense of Israel not relying on Arab labour. One of the key elements of the Zionist project was the importance of relying on Jewish labour, of not relying on Palestinian labour and so on. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't Palestinian Arabs who aren't exploited, who don't work within the framework of the Israeli-dominated area of Israel-Palestine, but they're not critical to the functioning of capitalism in that area. So we have a situation in which, because of the mass expulsion of the Palestinians in 48 and 67, the Israeli Jewish settlers are only slightly outnumbered by Palestinians in the territory of historic Palestine, which is radically different. In Zimbabwe, the whites at their height were 5% of the population in Zimbabwe. In South Africa, I can't remember, they were 12% or something like that. So it's not true that the Israelis within the territory of Palestine, historic territory of Palestine, are significantly outnumbered by the Palestinians. Moreover, the Israelis don't depend economically on the Palestinians. On the contrary, as we can see with the blockades that the Israelis have been mounted and the sanctions against the Palestinian territory, the situation is the other way round. And of course, Israel has the advantage of being subsidized and armed by the greatest imperialist power in the world. Now, that means that the Palestinians can't win the way in which other national liberation struggles could. It's not enough for the Palestinians to get organised themselves politically and develop armed struggle and begin to undermine the domination of the settler regime. That's not going to work. That hasn't worked over the last generation or so. And it's because of that structural limitation that the Palestinians have been pushed towards the disaster of the two-state solution, the coexistence of an Israeli and Palestinian state. There was a very good meeting yesterday in this room with Ghada Kami, arguing about not simply the failure, but the impossibility of a two-state solution. I don't want to reiterate everything that was said there, but just very briefly, since the existence of the State of Israel is premised upon the exclusion of the Palestinians. But the problem is that the Israelis were not able to achieve the American solution. They weren't able to kill off the Palestinians. So they coexist physically with the Palestinians, both within Israel itself and on a larger scale in the occupied territories. To coexist with a people who you've systematically robbed is a condition of structural insecurity. And therefore, it's perfectly logical for the Israelis to do what they're doing now, to try to fragment the territories, to control it from a security point of view. In other words, to prevent the Palestinians, even within the space of the territories, from having their own state. A two-state solution can only be a solution that involves Israeli domination. So the only solution for the Palestinians has to be a single Palestinian state. And for the benefit of anyone who's concerned about the fact that a majority of Palestinians are Muslims, and a shocking fact for some people on the left, let me emphasize that such a state should be a secular democratic state, open to all, independently of their religious beliefs and national origins, and so on and so forth. But the analysis that I put forward implies something more. It implies what has traditionally been the revolutionary socialist argument about Palestine, that because of the structural disadvantage that the Palestinians face relative to Israel, the only way the Palestinian struggle can succeed is as part of a broader revolutionary process which draws in the masses of the Arab East, the workers and peasants of the Arab East, and that challenges not just Israel, not just the US, but the Arab regimes themselves, the Arab ruling classes themselves. Tony Cliff, the founder of the International Socialist Tendency, used to say, the key to Palestine lies in Cairo. Why Cairo? Because Cairo is the capital of the Arab world, because Egypt has a massive working class. So when we hear one of the historic figures of the Egyptian left, Kamal Khalil, say last night at the opening rally of Marxism that the Egyptian working class is experiencing a spring with this strike wave, that's very, very important, not just for people in Egypt, it's very important for people throughout the region. And it may seem like an abstract formula to put it in these terms, but it's not. If you look, why was the PLO driven out of Lebanon in 1982 after the Israeli invasion? It wasn't just primarily because of Israel's military power and that sort of thing. It was because they were isolated from the local Lebanese population. There was a tragic moment when Amal, a Lebanese Shiite militia, started bombarding Palestinian refugee camps. Now, the Shiites are the poorest and most oppressed group of the Lebanese population, but they saw the Palestinians not as their allies, but as a kind of privileged external force that was making their lives worse rather than better. That reflected the whole strategy of Fatah and the PLO of allying themselves with the existing Arab regimes rather than allying themselves with the oppressed Arab masses. It's also not an abstract formula because, I should say that when I talk about this fusion of national and social struggles, of the struggle against the Arab ruling classes and against imperialism in Israel, that's a concrete application of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. The idea that democratic struggles against oppression, particularly in the so-called third world, can only succeed when they become intertwined with the struggle of the working class against capitalism itself. But to repeat, it's not an abstract formula. You see, when the neocons went into Iraq, they said that the road to Jerusalem lay via Baghdad. What they meant was the way to stabilise the Middle East on their terms, on American imperialist terms, was to invade Iraq and establish a loyal, liberal, capitalist, American-style regime in Iraq that would shift the whole balance of forces in the region in their favour and make it possible to stabilise, to resolve the Palestinian question on terms favourable to Israel. In other words, to eliminate the Palestinians as an independent political force. Now, the neocons were right, but not in the sense in which they meant. It's true that the road to Baghdad, sorry, let me get this right, the road to Jerusalem is via Baghdad, but in the opposite sense to what they meant, because through the unfolding defeat of the United States in Iraq, at the hands of the resistance in Iraq, we are seeing a weakening of imperialism and its allies throughout the region. And that weakening is critical to any success of the Palestinian struggle. It's not a unique miracle that Israel was defeated in Lebanon last year. It reflects, in particular, the effectiveness of Hezbollah as a movement that has organised the Shiites, the oppressed and exploited, probably majority of Lebanese society, and built a very effective armed struggle on that basis. But it's also a reflection of the weakening of American power in the region. It wasn't feasible for the Americans to act in support of Israel beyond sending them weapons, more bombs and things like that. Because of the way in which they've been dragged into what's been proved to be the black hole of Iraq. And so what we've seen is that Iraq, which was to be the point of strength for the United States and its allies in the region, because Israel was very strongly in favour of the attack on Iraq as well, has turned out to be their central point of vulnerability. Now, this has very concrete implications for building a solidarity movement against imperialism, against war, and in solidarity with the struggles for liberation and against occupation in the Middle East. It's a basis, not just of military strategy, but of political strategy, that you start where your enemy is weak, and particularly weak. And clearly, where our enemy is particularly weak is with respect to Iraq. Not actually only Iraq. If we look at Afghanistan, they're also fighting a very difficult guerrilla war there. There's increasing political divisions over that. The Social Democratic Party, one of the two parties in the coalition government in Germany, is now beginning to say we should cut down our troops in Afghanistan, which is very, very significant. And because it's in these areas, but particularly Iraq, I want to concentrate on Iraq, that the US and its allies are weakest. Any solidarity movement has to begin and focus its campaigning around the question of that war, the war on terrorism. That doesn't mean, of course, that the Palestinian struggle isn't very important. It's important in itself for the kind of reasons that I've given, and it's also important because it's a global symbol of imperialism's very brutal domination of the Middle East, and it's extremely important, therefore, to build solidarity with the Palestinian struggle and to campaign against what Israel is doing with the support of Western governments. But how one frames a campaign, how one frames an issue, is tremendously important politically. And what I'm saying is that those who want most effectively to campaign in solidarity with the Palestinians have to start not just, or not primarily with the Palestinian issue, but with the broader war on terrorism, and in particular the imperialist offensive in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that means, in terms of the broad solidarity, anti-imperialist, anti-war movements, I think in this country, but I'd argue that the same would be true in other countries as well, the critical campaigning framework is the Stop the War coalition, the coalition that campaigns primarily against the war on terrorism, although it also takes up the question of the Palestinians. I think this is confirmed negatively as I think what I said about our campaigning focus follows from the general analysis that I put. But I think it also, you can see negative confirmation in that if we look at the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is the body that focuses on campaigning about Palestine in this country, really when you think of the disasters that have affected the Palestinians in recent years, some of which I've referred to, it's remarkable how relatively ineffective the PSC has been on mobilising around the issue of Palestine. What was the biggest, if you like, anti-Israel demonstration in Britain in recent years? It was the one organised at very short notice by the Stop the War Coalition in August last year over the question of Lebanon, over the Lebanese invasion. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign has been unable to mobilise anything like that scale. I think that's partly to do with other limitations in the PSC's politics. For example, its stress on a two-state solution, which I think is hopeless for the kind of reasons that I've tried to spell out already. But it has, the difficulty with just focusing on Palestine is that because it's a saga of defeat and destruction and suffering and despair, and a story that continues, it's very hard to mobilise on a very broad basis. People may feel terrible about what's happening to the Palestinians, but if you don't see a way in which the Palestinian struggle can advance, it's hard to maintain the enthusiasm and get people out on a large scale on demonstrations. If you put it in the framework of what's happening more broadly in the Middle East, what's happening in Iraq, Israel's defeat in Lebanon, then the situation is transformed. But then you're not simply starting with the question of Palestine. Now, just a few more issues, points about solidarity and so on. More concretely on solidarity with Palestine, a very important twinning campaign has developed in recent years, not just in this country, but internationally, which has been a very important way of bringing home to and making systematic the relationship between the Palestinian struggle and people in different communities and workplaces in different parts of the world. It's a very important initiative. It's an initiative which has become considerably more complicated in the last few weeks because of the civil war that's developing in the Palestine Authority, which poses the question very sharply, given that there's now this separation politically between the West Bank of Gaza of who it is that you're twinning with at the present time. So the disaster in Palestine is even, it's not destroying the twinning campaign, but it's making it more difficult. But it's nevertheless an initiative that has to be supported. There are also the boycotts. There's the question of the boycott of Israel, which has moved to up the political agenda in Britain because of votes at different union conferences in support. Well, in the case of my own union, the University and College Union, all that the Congress did was to vote to discuss a boycott, but this has produced the most hysterical reaction in the media and so on. Now, that reaction often is completely hypocritical. There's a man called Dershowitz, a lawyer at Harvard, who has been very publicly threatening to sue USU and every individual member of USU, and God knows who else, for every penny that they have for daring to say anything remotely critical of Israel. Now, it's a joke that this man should present himself as a defender of human rights. He's someone who, after 9/11, wrote a series of articles defending torture. He's also the man who campaigned to prevent Norman Finkelstein, a very well-known anti-Zionist historian, to prevent him from getting tenure at DePaul University in Chicago in the United States. So, you know, what can I say? This man is scum. And there's no reason to take... Well, he is, sorry. Scum is a kind of scientific description for someone of his sort. So, at a fundamental level, I don't think there's any reason why anyone who supports the Palestinian struggle and is anti-Zionist should feel in the least defensive when attacked by these these kinds of people. I mean, he says, why don't we take seriously the issue of Darfur? I mean, it's one of the signs of how corrupt American political culture is, that there's a massive campaign in the United States for military intervention on Darfur. And this campaign, the people involved in this campaign don't notice that their own government is occupying Iraq and slaughtering hundreds of thousands of people. It's disgusting. And there's also no question that the fact that unions like USU and Unison have now passed boycott motions by big majorities. In the case of Unison, by I think a 3-1 majority, an indication of the growing revulsion against what Israel is doing and a growing sense of solidarity with the Palestinians. However, I think that it's important not to see the argument over the boycott as an end in itself, because if we look at the history of international solidarity movements, boycotts are a tactic, not a principle. They were used in Britain for a long time in the era of the Franco dictatorship. Socialists campaigned to boycott holidays in Spain. The Greek resistance during the period of the Greek dictatorship, however, opposed a boycott campaign because they thought it would be useful for as much movement between Greece and the rest of Europe to take place. In the case of South Africa, there was an enormous boycott campaign that developed in the course of the 1980s. But there were some quite complicated arguments that had to develop because, for example, the academic boycott, which was pressed quite strongly, began to run up against the fact that increasingly South African universities were dominated not just by students but by staff who were part of the anti-apartheid struggle. And there was a real problem about trying to isolate those people. So a boycott can be quite a blunt weapon, even when we're talking about very big movements developing. And in the case, I think it's important, if we look, again, I just talk about my own union for a minute, USU. In USU, the left it's a new union, and the first executive has a left-wing majority. Now, the whole series of issues that we have to address, for example, in my own college, there's a compulsory redundancy taking place. There are lots of other similar issues going on all over the country. And it would be a disaster if the left and the militants in unions like USU simply got trapped into a debate about the boycott, which, to the exclusion of everything else, which could be used by the right wing in the union to isolate the left by their pushing to hold a membership ballot on the issue, which I think would be intended to really give the left a hammering. So I'm not going to draw any tactical conclusions about what that means concretely when it comes to the debates about the boycott in any individual union. But it's very important to remember, when approaching the issue of the boycott, that this is a tactical issue rather than an issue of principle. And it's often an issue that raises questions of great complexity. And you can wonder and worry about how to trace your way through the complexity of the issue. The only way out of that is to have a very clear framework of principle and analysis. And what I've been trying to do is to set out that general framework, not primarily to do with the question of the boycott, because it's just one detail of a much larger tapestry. What I've been trying to do is to put forward my sense of the shape of the overall tapestry. And the overall shape involves, it seems to me critically, both an understanding of the way in which the Palestinians are victims of imperialism and require our total solidarity, but also a recognition of the peculiar structural and historical bind that the Palestinians find themselves in, and therefore of the extent to which the success of their struggle is dependent upon broader shifts in the overall relations of forces taking place in the Middle East as a region. The happy thing that one can say is that despite the appalling situation of the Palestinians, I think the larger balance of forces is shifting. I mean, the American army say they control a third of Baghdad, several months into the surge. In other words, the biggest imperialist power in the world is losing a war in a country that matters much more than Vietnam. The Egyptian working class is beginning to revive after really something like 30 years of silence. Those kinds of moves represent the possibility of a really profound shift of the balance of forces in the region, which can open up a much more hopeful chapter for the Palestinian people themselves.
Thanks very much, Alex. There's lots of people who've got slips in, which is brilliant, but it does mean I'm going to ask speakers to stick to 3 minutes, and I will tap on the mic like that after 2 minutes just to give you warning. And I would ask everybody I call to come and use the microphone that Alex has been using because the meeting is being taped. The first speaker is Danny Rooney from Glasgow University, and Danny will be followed by Sue Blackwell.
Firstly, I want to agree with everything that Alex said, particularly about the grassroots movement in the Middle East. I think that's very, very important to Palestinian resistance. They can't win on their own militarily, and it's very important that the resistance movements around the Middle East link up to give the Palestinians more military might in their struggle against one of the top military powers in the world. I think there was something that was missed out in his speech, though, which is the mentality of the Israeli population, which, understandably from the history of the Jews, which we're all aware of the millennia and millennia of genocide after ethnic cleansing, Israel sees itself as a refugee camp, essentially. It's based on the ideology of a guy called Chaim Weizmann, who came up with this idea that if the Jews were all together in one place where there were only Jews, there would be no racism inside it, and there wouldn't, and therefore there wouldn't be any Holocausts. There wouldn't be any more genocide if that could be established. What it means is that space has to be created artificially, and it's created by military might that took the form of the 1948 war, the war that has never stopped and is still going on to this day, and forms the occupation of Palestine. My problem with the two-state solution is that it doesn't get rid of these people that still follow this ideology. These people will always be pushing for enough land to store the entire world's Jewry in the event of another Holocaust. A two-state solution will not solve this problem. So even if we do get peace between Israel and Palestine for a few years, we will not get this for a long duration of time. What we need to do is turn this separatist project on its head, turn it back to what Tom Segev described in his book, One Palestine Complete, as a Tower of Babel, which is what Jerusalem was apparently known as in the British Mandate period. Now, there's a lot of problems with Jerusalem and the British Mandate, undoubtedly, but a Tower of Babel, a celebration of multiculturalism, is what we need to fight for in Palestine, and we need the Israeli population to be rebelling against their own governments, their leaders, which are promoting this through the intense propaganda system, including guys like Alan Dershowitz from the United States. These guys, we need to get the Israelis on our side as well, and we need to do that through the diaspora, through the Jews that are in Britain, in America, and around the world. Because of the intense propaganda in Israel, if you disagree with Chaim Weizmann's idea of what Israel should be, you leave. I'm told it's what Ilan Pappé is doing at the moment. Ilan Pappé, for those of you that aren't aware of him, is a Israeli historian. But I'm told that he's. I'll just finish on this point. That he's under too much pressure in Israel, so he's moving out of Israel to to pursue his ideas outside. It's just too intense for anti-Zionist Israelis inside Israel, and need to go, and we need to activate them in the West.
Sue will be followed by Malcolm Povey.
Thanks, comrades. I'm glad Alex gave so much attention to the academic boycott, and I'd like to endorse what he said about that and to follow on from it. By the way, I'm one of the left members of the UCU executive that Alex referred to, and we're also a member of BRICUP, the British Committee for Universities of Palestine, and I hope you'll all buy our booklet on the way out. Quick plug. Why an academic boycott of Israel? Just look at the difference of what academic freedom means for Israelis and what it means for Palestinians. What does academic freedom mean for Israelis? It means the freedom for racist academics to make absolutely vile pronouncements. People like Arnon Sofer, who until recently was the head of the Department of Geography at Haifa University, who was invited by Ariel Sharon to bring his maps along to help him to draw up the route that the apartheid wall was going to take through not around the West Bank, but through the West Bank. It's a massive land grab, of course, and he boasts quite openly that it's his map that Sharon used. He's the architect of the apartheid wall. He was also reported in the Jerusalem Post as saying, if we, meaning Israeli Jews, if we want to remain alive, we will have to kill and kill and kill, all day, every day. If we don't kill, we will cease to exist. Absolutely racist pronouncements. His Arab students apparently call him Arnon Transfer, because that is what he advocates, the mass expulsion of Arab citizens of Israel, who are about 20% of the population. He's not the only case. There are many people like that. Just after the AUT boycott resolution in 2005, the Herzl Centre at Herzl Institute at Haifa University, around the anniversary of the Nakba actually, held a conference on the demographic threat and the solution to the demographic threat. What did they mean? They mean Arab people having too many babies. That is the demographic threat. Were there any Arab academics invited to this conference? No. There was a picket of it. Arab and Jewish students, I'm glad to say, jointly picketed that. They were carried off by security and treated extremely roughly. Now, I think if we were to try and hold a conference at Birmingham University on the demographic threat in Birmingham, because in a few years' time, most school students in Birmingham are going to be non-white, am I bothered by that? No. But, if we had a racist conference like that, we'd be out there picketing it, and it wouldn't be allowed to happen, I think. But that is the norm for Israel. There is no academic freedom, on the contrary, for Palestinians. I believe academic freedom believes with the right to have an education, the right to go to school or college or university, the right to go and teach without numerous checkpoints, roadblocks, being attacked by the IDF. And we have to get that message across. So please support the academic boycott, and please buy the BRICUP leaflet.
Okay. The next speaker is Malcolm Povey, and he'll be followed by John Rees.
Malcolm Povey, SWP and UCU NEC. First of all, I'd like to say I welcome very much the analysis we've heard from Alex, and reiterate the point he made about how we have to tread very carefully over the boycott debate, and in particular that if we don't get the trade union ABC right within higher education, then we're not going to be able to carry any debate forward around the boycott effectively. I wanted just to make a couple of points. First of all, why, in one of the predecessor unions to the UCU, the AUT, much to all our surprise, voted for a motion proposed by Sue Blackwell for a boycott. And the people went absolutely bonkers about it. I mean, death threats to Sue, but actually it was debated in the Israeli cabinet. The Israeli embassy intervened directly in our special Congress, where the vote was overturned. And in the motion that was actually passed earlier this year was about a debate. Now, and people are talking about why we should not have a debate. People who say they're Democrats, we shouldn't debate. Now, why are they going mad? Part of the reason is to do with the way that Israel sees itself as a bridgehead of European culture in the Middle East, and the academic links are very important in terms of bolstering this. But I think, just to bring my comments to a close, from the left's point of view, the debate needs to be prolonged, because the longer the debate goes on, the more people come round to the Palestinian cause. And in fact, the right wants to curtail this debate, and Sally Hunt, the General Secretary, wants it all over within, I think, about 6 weeks. And this means, in particular, that I think the left needs to argue to prolong the debate out into next year, and that we need, in particular, there's going to be no meetings anywhere up the whole northeast of England in regional meetings. So we need to be arguing for more meetings, not less.
Okay, the next speaker is John Rees, and he'll be followed by Ruth Lorimer.
Yes, I think some of the tactical difficulties arise from this circumstance, that although the problems, and they are very deep structural problems that Alex outlined in his introduction for the Palestinians, are enormous, the effect of the anti-war movement in this country has been to create a sympathy for the Palestinians larger than probably any time that I can remember in my political experience. If you look even at the opinion polls, there are now more people sympathetic to the case of the Palestinians in this country than there are sympathetic to the Israeli state. Although we should also note about those opinion polls that nearly half of the respondents simply don't give an answer. In other words, there's still an enormous amount of confusion. But among those, the 50% who do give an answer, there's slightly more who are sympathetic to the Palestinians. Now, in my view, this situation is exclusively, or almost exclusively, to do with the impact of the anti-war movement. If you have an anti-war movement on the scale of the Stop the War coalition, and if the people within it put a case about the Palestinians, then people draw very quickly the connection between the American occupation of Iraq and what happens to the Palestinians. They begin to understand the imperial architecture of the Middle East, begin to reevaluate the Palestinian question in that light. And so the first principle, as far as I'm concerned, is there is no advance for the Palestinian argument but other than under the umbrella of the wider argument about the war on terror and the American imperial project. That is how we've got the advance we have, and that is the only way that it can be sustained and reinforced. And this brings me to the question of how we conduct the argument in UCU and other places. It has to continue to be embedded in a wider argument about the American imperial project and about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. The minute it begins to step beyond that, the argument isn't unwinnable, but it's a lot harder to win when you step beyond that framework. And then there's a simple tactical argument which applies in this case, as in any case, of a trade union vote, and it especially applies when the left are in a leadership position in the union. And it is this: don't call a vote unless you think you can win it. Because if you can't win it, if you lose it, then the right wing will be strengthened, the Palestinian cause disadvantaged, and it will roll on from there, because they are connected, to the whole anti-war movement. In my union, the National Union of Journalists had a members' ballot on affiliation, not to Stop the War, not to Palestine Solidarity Campaign, it had a ballot on affiliation to CND. They lost the ballot. They lost the ballot in the NUJ for affiliation to the CND. Now, I'll tell you this, there isn't going to be a ballot anytime soon about affiliation to the Stop the War coalition, let alone any question of affiliating to anybody else where the argument will be harder. In other words, because the vote was put before the argument was won amongst the membership, it actually rebounded to the disadvantage of the left and to the disadvantage of those people with whom we're trying to get solidarity. And therefore, Malcolm Povey is absolutely right. This is a long, low-key discussion in which over time we hope to win the argument, and it can only be advanced properly in the wider context of the Stop the War coalition.
Next speaker is Ruth, and after Ruth is John Rose. But just before Ruth speaks, there's a question that somebody wants read out, which is, what form do you believe a boycott of Israeli academics should take? Should anti-Zionist Israelis be boycotted? Is there any hope of uniting ordinary Israelis with the Palestinian struggle? Okay, Ruth.
Most of what I was going to say has already been said, so I'd just like to tell a little anecdote. There's been a lot of talk about unions and resolutions put to union conferences. A friend of mine is in the TSSA union, that bastion of revolution. There was a motion put to their conference to disaffiliate from Labour Friends of Israel, and the General Secretary who spoke against this motion, his reason for doing so was that when he sits at banquets with the Israeli ambassador, he can talk in his ear about the terrible things that are being done to the Palestinians, and that he really listens to him, and this really makes a difference. Now, although this is quite depressing that this is going on in trade union, in a way we can take something positive from it, that a few years ago, Israel was seen, even by large sections of the left, as some kind of socialist utopia. And now even the supporters of Zionism are being forced to acknowledge that what is being done to the Palestinians is unacceptable. So I think that we can be positive that we've moved the argument that far to the left, and we just need to keep doing so with the Stop the War movement, and like everybody's already said.
Thank you. The next speaker is John Rose, and he'll be followed by Michael Lavalette.
I just want to push a little bit further the point that Alex made about the Islamist movement, because everything he says is true, but whether we like it or not, at the moment, Islamist politics dominates the Middle East, and it dominates the different types of the resistance movements. I'm talking now about the mass-based Islamist movements, which are very important to us, and we shouldn't, although Alex mentioned it, we shouldn't lose sight of the real importance of the Hezbollah victory over Israel in the summer. And just a point about the Cairo conference, I was also at the conference with Alex, and one of its important characteristics is the degree to which the mass-based Islamic movements are in a dialogue with the secular left. There's a number of ways in which that's already proved to be important. At the last conference, we actually helped to shift an argument away from a criticism of Iran and an attempt to kind of link Iran and America in a horrible sort of Sunni-Shia split. As a result of the dialogue the secular left is having with the Islamists, we're able to shift that argument. So this is for real, and it's fantastically important. Now, as a result of that, what we do here is very important. Now, of course, the most important thing we're doing in terms of expressing our solidarity is indeed through the Stop the War campaign, but it's also important that we do find ways of expressing our solidarity with the Palestinians, which, of course, does then bring me on to the boycott question. I'm also a member of UCAN. I'm sorry this aspect's dominating. I think the UCAN members are going to be called, and necessarily we're going to talk about this because they are under tremendous pressure, partly as a result of the great victory we had at the conference. That was just for starters. That was a victory at the conference in terms of the activists, but the activists are a small minority compared to the mass of the membership. So I'm also in favour of a long discussion and avoiding a ballot before it's necessary. But one thing that's already very clear, and I really want to just focus on this point, is that the boycott, the argument about the debate about the boycott has already, and the Zionist pressure on us has to a degree put them in a very difficult position, because they appear not just to be against the boycott, but to be against democracy. And it's very important that we pursue that argument. So in other words, the union has just agreed to a series of regional meetings. The left in the union has some control over how those meetings are going to be managed. The process is partly up to us in terms of where the meetings are held, who goes to them, the speakers which are selected, and so on. And it's fantastically important that we get the democratic element exactly right. And there's an enormous amount riding on this. There's fantastic interest. I quite agree with everyone who's saying a boycott is just a tactic, and it's often a very difficult tactic for the left. That's certainly the case. But in a sense, this thing is now up and running, and it's very important that we shape it and that we introduce the politics that we want. I'll just end on this note. There's a UKU website where there's a fierce debate raging between the Zionists and their critics over this. It's a UKU website. And the Zionists are desperate to keep the argument all around anti-Semitism. You're all anti-Semites, blah, blah, blah. However, one of them, the last couple of days, very foolishly has responded to a criticism, a detailed criticism, about how the Israelis are persecuting the Palestinians inside Palestinian universities, and has claimed that their group has also been sympathetic to the Palestinians. Now, that's a very important opening. In other words, the detail of how Palestinian school students, Palestinian academics are daily hounded, their academic freedom is daily destroyed by the Israelis, is the terrain we need to move on to. And the detailed facts about that are absolutely central in terms of how we begin to assemble the case. Because at some point, and I end on this, at some point we're going to have to redefine the objectives of the boycott. It's far too grand at the moment. A boycott of Israeli institutions basically means nothing, and it gives the other side far too much ammunition in terms of a tradition of boycotts against Jews, in terms of tax and academic freedom, etc. We have to shift the terrain onto something much more focused, on something which genuinely begins to win. I will finish. Win sympathetic Israelis to our side. We've got time to do this. The more time, the better.
Thanks, John. The next speaker is Michael Lavalette, and he'll be followed by Lindsay German.
Michael Lavalette. I'm a Respect councillor, but I'm also a UCU member, so I'm going to hear from Nissa. Cummins, the last time I was in the West Bank was last September, and there's two things that really fit into what Alex said that I just want to sort of bring to your attention. The first thing is that when you go onto the West Bank, we have this image of the West Bank of being absolutely impoverished, and there are vast parts of the West Bank which that's absolutely right. But one of the things that you notice as you drive into Ramallah is that there's some incredibly affluent houses all around Ramallah, and therefore that notion of class within the Palestinian community is absolutely central, and the whole notion of corruption around Fatah and the leadership and how they've benefited from it is absolutely central, and it hits you right in the face when you drive into Ramallah. The second thing is that as I went into one of the refugee camps just outside Nablus, the Balata refugee camp, I arrived on a Thursday morning, and the night before the Israeli Air Force had dropped incendiary devices that were shaped like chocolate bars, and a young kid had picked it up and it had blown his hand off. Now, I tell that story because when you go and you come across these things, it fills you with absolute moral and political outrage. And you come back and it's very easy to start off with the tragedy of the Palestinians and what they're suffering in the refugee camps. And on a Thursday night, every Palestinian student who's on their way home is held for hours and hours and hours at every roadblock as they try to go home for the weekend. As they come back on the Saturday, they're held for hours and hours at the roadblocks as they try to go back to university. On their campuses, they are constantly raided, and their academic freedom is absolutely curtailed. So it is possible to come back and think that the most important thing in the world really is the struggle of the Palestinians. But it is important that we start off with a broader picture of what's happening over the Middle East and link it into what we can do in Britain in terms of our anti-imperialist struggle. So I want to come back to what Sue said. You see, when Sue said if there are all these horrible Israeli academics and we should have nothing to do with them, that's absolutely right. There's no doubt about that. When Sue says that there's a conference in which people are talking about how they can reinforce the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, of course we should be outside picketing it no matter where it is. Nobody's at all suggesting that we should do that. But we have got ourselves facing a very particular problem in the UCU, and it does seem to me that there's an obvious solution here. And that one of the things is that the Zionist lobby is running this in terms of academic freedom. And I think we should be the ones who are raising the banner of academic freedom. The ones whose freedom and academic rights are being curtailed are the Palestinian students, are the Palestinian academics, are those at the universities in Nablus and Bethlehem and on the Gaza and in Beer Zeit. And it seems to me that one of the ways that we can take the argument forward in UCU is at our branch level, at Birmingham University, at Liverpool University where I work, to start to talk about twinning and supporting the academic freedom of those Palestinian students and academics whose freedom is curtailed by the imposition of the Israeli occupation.
Thank you, Michael. The next speaker is going to be Lindsay German, who I'm afraid is going to have to be the last speaker.
I wanted to say two things. Firstly, about the boycott, I don't think that we should just assume that this boycott is opposed by people who are Zionists. There are many people who aren't Zionists, who regard themselves on the left, who also don't like the boycott, including most of the left bureaucrats, if you like, in the UCU. And I'm not talking about Sally Hunt here, obviously, but people like Paul Mackney, all sorts of people on the left who don't do it. And therefore that makes it a lot harder for us. We should also not confuse, on the one hand, the boycott in UCU and the NUJ, where people feel that somehow they've got some professional duty to deal with people in Israel, and this is an report about what is going on in Israel, with what was passed at unison, which actually wasn't a boycott motion. It called for absolutely nothing to be done by unison, but had a lot about boycott in the preamble. When it comes to it, what it really is saying, don't buy Israeli fruit and veg, which is fair enough, but it doesn't have the same weight in terms of what people have to do in terms of their work. And it's important that people understand the distinction between the two. And this is one reason this is a much harder argument for us, and which is why I agree very much with the people who've said about this isn't just a question of moralism, it is a question of tactics, and we have to look very, very carefully at the tactics. There's one other point I want to make, which is to reinforce Alex's analysis about Palestine. You see, many people, including most people in the Arab world, and a lot of people on the left in this country, really believe Palestine is the key to the situation in the Middle East. It isn't. The key to the situation in the Middle East is imperialism, because imperialism is not just what has occupied Iraq and has intervened in all these countries, but actually is the force responsible for the setting up of the Israeli state, incidentally a racist state. We hear a lot about Islamic states being a bad idea, but people don't talk about a state which is actually based on race and religion, which is the only one that exists in that form in the Middle East. But this was a construction of Western imperialism. That is what it is. What is the Arab rulers who don't give anything but lip service to the Palestinians are clients of Western imperialism. And therefore, we have to, and the Palestinian catastrophe is a consequence of this. Not the cause of it, it's the consequence of it. And I think we have to understand it that way round, because when we talk about the road to Jerusalem lies through Baghdad or Cairo, wherever people are talking about doing, actually this is the key. You cannot talk about solving the problem of the Palestinians without the Arab masses, the workers and the peasants throughout the Arab world, dealing with their own rulers, who are the autocratic monarchies, and the dictators, who are the clients of the Americans and the British and all the other Western powers. And until we understand that, if we don't understand that, we elevate the question of moralism with the Palestinians above the question of grappling with Western imperialism and its crucial role in the Middle East.
Thank you, Lindsay. Many thanks to everybody who contributed, and sorry for all the people we didn't have time to call, but I think it's time for Alex to sum up and give his thoughts on the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, I want to respond to the first contribution by Danny, who said I hadn't paid enough, or indeed any, attention to the mentality of the Israeli population. That's true. I'm not deeply interested in what the majority of the Israeli population think, to be frank. It's very important, if we're going to be able to address the issue of Israel and Palestine properly, that we start with an understanding of what Israel is. I mean, Lindsay's absolutely right. The key to the Middle East is the question of imperialism. But within the broad imperialist framework, Israel is a settler colonial state. That's what it is. And you have to see it as a settler colonial state. It's not true that Israel was founded in response to the Holocaust. The Zionist project long predates the Holocaust. The Holocaust is important from the point of view of the Israeli state, critically as a means of legitimizing its project, and it's very important externally, because it as we see with the boycott debate, it allows them to play the anti-Semitism card. And although I'm absolutely contemptuous of their use of the anti-Semitism card, it's very important to see that this makes a difference to the arguments. In the case of apartheid South Africa, when the boycott came up, the defenders of the apartheid regime found themselves in increasing trouble because all they could fall back on was vague invocations of appeals to racist fears and that sort of thing. And as the crisis deepened in South Africa, more and more people globally could see what a rotten regime the South African regime was, and they identified with the black majority and welcomed Mandela's release and so on and so forth. The Israeli regime have this important ideological card, which is provided by the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, which we cannot afford to underestimate. Nevertheless, in terms of the reality of Israel, I think it's largely irrelevant, to be absolutely honest. Israel is a settler colonial state, and that means, fundamentally, of its essence, it is racist and is permeated by racist ideology. As a young, naive student, I paid my only visit to Israel in 1972, and it was a very shocking experience for me. I should say that I was born and brought up in what was then southern Rhodesia, so I was brought up in a settler colonial state, and what struck me was the affinity between Israel and Rhodesia. I remember we were on a tour, and we visited the Dome of the Rock, the great mosque in the centre of Jerusalem. The tour guide, who was Israeli, said, "Oh, don't bother to go in there." And he wasn't saying because you should be respectful of the people who are praying or any of the kind of arguments that you might get for not entering a mosque. He said it's full of rather smelly people. And I've never forgotten that. And you see, when Sue talks about conferences on the demographic threat, in other words, on the threat of the Palestinians breeding more quickly than the Jewish Israeli settlers, that's not just a bit of detailed nastiness. That kind of essentially racist outlook is inherent in the character of the Israeli state, and that outlook is shared by the large majority of Israeli Jews, not because they're nasty people, but because their structural position in the Middle East forces them to see the Palestinian majority and Arabs more generally as a threat to them. Therefore, someone asked a question of, can we win the majority of Israelis to our side, etc., etc. The only way in which that is going to happen is if there's a shift in the balance of power. If it looks like the Arabs and Palestinians are winning, then that will be the sole condition, as in the case of South Africa and Zimbabwe and so on, where some significant numbers of Israelis will start rethinking their outlook and interests. Secondly, John Rose raised the question of the rise of the Islamist movements, which of course is particularly important in Palestine with the development of Hamas, but which we can see elsewhere with Hezbollah and so on. These are very important movements, and it's very important that we don't share the kind of, at best childish, at worst proto-racist fear of these movements that many on the, not just the Western left, but also the Arab left, have towards these movements. Hamas is an extremely serious movement which is proving itself a much more effective opponent of Israel than Fatah is. That's the truth. And we should approach them in a grown-up way, and where there are conditions for us fighting on the same side as them, we should be prepared to do that. We shouldn't at the same time have too rosy a view of these movements, because what I said about their being subject to the same contradictions as movements like Fatah is really important. I mean, at the Cairo conference, the dominant force in the Cairo conference was the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which is a very impressive organisation with a mass base, very, impressive youth cadre, very politically serious, wanting to debate in a very unsectarian way with atheist Marxists and so on and so forth. Great, in all sorts of ways. It's a movement that is subject to systematic repression on the part of the Egyptian regime, but the great democrats of the West don't seem to care about that and so on. But you have to understand that the Muslim Brotherhood, talking to the Muslim Brotherhood leadership, it's clear they see themselves as an equivalent of Western Christian Democrats. In other words, they want to be bourgeois, liberal parliamentarians in a capitalist Egypt. I'm not saying that's true of everyone in the Muslim Brotherhood, but that's the outlook of their leadership. They're not a revolutionary force. If they could make a deal with the Egyptian ruling class and American imperialism, they would. The problem is that American imperialism and Mubarak and so on don't give them the space for doing that, and therefore they're forced into alliance with the revolutionary left. But because they're essentially a fairly conservative bourgeois party, they're very reluctant to use methods of mass struggle, open struggle against the regime. So we have to understand the strengths of these movements and approach them in a mature and in certain circumstances comradely way when we're confronting common enemies, but we shouldn't be naive about them as well. Finally, back to the question of the boycott. I think the boycott is significant. The votes for the boycott and discussion of the boycott and so on and so forth are primarily significant as a symptom of the growing revulsion against Israel in Britain, which is in advance. It's important to emphasise is in advance of many other Western societies, not just the United States, but you couldn't have even a debate about the kind of debate that we're having about the boycott in major trade unions that we're having in Britain, in countries like France and Germany. And I'm sure that reflects what John was saying about the significance of the anti-war movement and so on here. But that's primarily the significance of the boycott debate. It's a reflection of a broader ideological shift that is making this, in a significant way, a more anti-imperialist society than many other societies in other parts of the world, which is a historic reversal, you know. This is after all, you know, we're in the capital of what was the British Empire, and clearly our rulers would like to continue that in some way. It's a very significant phenomenon that's taking place. In terms of the tactics and so on and so forth, I think what Michael Lavalette said was really important. That the reason why the Israelis are so furious about Yusu is because the breaking of links between Israeli and Western academic institutions, and it is a question of boycotting institutions, that's what people are talking about, not anything else, undermines the legitimacy of Israel as an extension of the capitalist West in the Middle East. That's why they care about it so much. And I think it's important that we respond, as Michael suggested, by taking up the question of academic freedom. And in that sense, John Rose was talking about making the campaign more focused. I think focusing it on the denial of academic freedom to Palestinians is a very good way of turning the argument back on the Israelis and their Zionist allies. The other thing is, you see, Lizzie talked about the unison motion. One of the good things about it's true, there's much less kind of commitment to even the idea of action than there is in the Yusu motion that was passed. One of the things that's good about it is it puts its focus on the responsibility of the British government and other Western governments when it comes to the question of Palestine. It, for example, proposes a UN embargo of Israel, which at one level, given the complicity of the Western powers and the UN in the oppression of the Palestinians, may seem like cloud cuckoo land, but in another sense, it turns the responsibility back towards the Western powers in terms of what they're doing to Palestine. And I think that, if we're talking about trying to continue the boycott argument, not allowing the right wing to rush it to a rapid conclusion, certainly in Yusu, then in continuing the argument, I think we need to redirect it much more away from what it means in terms of British academics and Israeli academics, away from that, and much more to pointing the finger of responsibility towards our government, towards the American government, Germany, etc., Bush, Blair, and so on what they're doing to destroy the Palestinians. That's not just a kind of appropriate thing to do tactically. It's surely what we do as a matter of principle. The Palestinians, every day, are being battered further into the ground by Israel in alliance with the West. And it's a matter of duty on our part that we should do what we can to help them to face that offensive. And I hope in this meeting we've clarified the major steps towards doing that.